And a very warm welcome to day 2 of the EV Summit. Many thanks to everyone joining us online for another day of panel discussions and networking across the global electric vehicle industry. We have a huge global audience joining us, an international lineup of many of the most significant leaders in the e-mobility sector. And we're welcoming a presenter this afternoon from the United States, Erica Myers from the World Resources Institute. This is the 3rd edition of the EV Summit, so thank you to everybody who's been joining us for all 3 years, and to those who are joining us for the first time this year. We are very, very happy to have you with us. The summit looks very different this year as we've had to move online for the first time. And we saw this as a challenge and an opportunity to create a new digital space for the e-mobility community. We want you to be able to connect and bring our pre-arranged meetings format online to both the summit and beyond. So we hope you've been enjoying the high-class panel discussions that we had yesterday and the networking opportunities so far. We're thrilled to bring you another day of thought leadership from world-leading speakers across the sector. Today, we will bring you panels on international charging infrastructure, mainstreaming electric vehicles, fleet electrification, vans and trucks, 2 wheels, and last but definitely not least, research. The EV Summit has always been deeply interactive, and yesterday our insightful online audience added greatly to discussion with some fantastic questions from our panelists. So please continue to send in your questions to our panel speakers via the chat throughout the whole day. To open up our morning session, we welcome the Right Honourable Grant Shapps MP, Secretary of State for Transport. Secretary of State, the EV Summit thanks you for addressing this year's event.
Good morning, everyone. I know good news has been in short supply this year, and we've still got a lot of work to do to beat COVID. But long after the virus has been eradicated from these shores, Britain will be benefiting from the announcement last month to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. Our air will be cleaner, our children healthier, our contribution to climate change substantially diminished, and our economy stronger too, with UK-based manufacturers and suppliers spearheading a green motoring revolution. Now, this country has built some of the most spectacular cars of the internal combustion era on the roads and on the racetracks too. But by setting the bar high for the introduction of electric vehicles, we're putting ourselves in pole position to reap the industrial success in the zero-emission era. Of course, the environmental lobby was always going to support such a move, and I'm grateful for their backing. But what was notable about this particular announcement was the positive response it received from the motoring industry. The car makers' trade body, the SMMT, said it shared our ambition to decarbonise road transport. Bentley Motors, a name synonymous with some of the most powerful cars in history, immediately welcomed the news and committed to an all-electric model lineup within the next 9 years. And Jaguar Land Rover said it was already moving to a zero-emission future. Now, even just a few years ago, such a response would have been unthinkable. It's not only evidence of how far opinions have shifted, but also how much progress the car industry's made technologically. And it deserves huge credit for that. Nonetheless, I know the time frame we've set is demanding, not just for the car manufacturers, but for government too. We've already committed £1.5 billion to support early market and remove barriers to zero-emission vehicle ownership. But alongside the new phase-out date, we've pledged a further £2.8 billion to help industry and consumers make the switch. With up to £1 billion to support electrification of UK vehicles and their supply chains, £1.3 billion to accelerate the rollout of charging infrastructure, and a further £582 million for plug-in vehicle grants. This transformational funding will make us a front-runner in electric car technology and production globally. And it will incentivize many thousands more customers to choose a plug-in vehicle as their next car. And it will give us one of the most comprehensive charging networks of any country in the world, including rapid charging hubs at every service station on England's motorways and A roads. That means by the time you've had a cup of tea or coffee, your vehicle will be fully charged. As an electric car owner with a pretty busy schedule myself, I know this will be critically important, persuading people to drive electric. Now, as of last week, I've also taken delivery of green number plate, a new scheme which will raise awareness of rapidly increasing numbers of electric vehicles on our roads, and which could help benefit owners from local initiatives like free parking or unrestricted access to local emission zones. Now, those of you with electric cars will understand when I say the past 18 months has turned me into a fervent champion for plug-in technology. But it's not just opened my eyes to the benefits of going green, it's also given me a useful perspective on the challenges we face over the next 9 years as we head to that 2030 deadline. So we will publish a delivery plan next year, setting out how we'll meet our new phase-out dates with milestones along the way. And we'll also publish a green paper on the post-EU regulatory regime for CO2 emissions from new road vehicles. And as host and president of COP26, the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow next November, the international community will expect us to show leadership on climate change. Although the growth in sales of zero-emission vehicles globally is outpacing expectations, some estimates say they'll make up half of all new car sales by 2040 globally. That rate of change simply is not fast enough. To achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, 100% of new car sales need to be zero emission by then. In other words, double the pace of those most optimistic estimates. And that's why Zero Emission Vehicles campaign is one of 5 priorities we've selected to focus on during our presidency. And it's why we've convened ministers and representatives from some of the world's largest and most progressive car markets to form a new Zero Emissions Vehicle Transformation Council, which met for the very first time at the end of November. Now, I don't expect many people will be sad to see the back of 2020. When we look back at this most miserable of years, let's not forget that 2020 also set this country on a decisive new path towards decarbonisation, a path that consigns the internal combustion engine after over a century of dominance to history, a path that the whole industry can travel, and a path that will transform motoring within a generation. Thank you.
Many, many thanks to the Secretary of State there for providing that important update and sharing government views. And reflecting that whilst it has been a difficult year, and we've seen it ourselves in running the summit, lots and lots of changes, but also a year that has reflected electric vehicles really coming into their own. So now to our first panel of the day, the Crucial International Charging Infrastructure panel. The global market value of electric vehicle charging infrastructure is forecast to grow at 24%, reach $40 billion per year by 2030. And our panelists are right at the heart of this rapidly growing market. We are asking our panelists today the question, what challenges your local markets? What are you facing with the rollout of charging infrastructure? And what lessons do you take from other markets? So we are delighted that Ubertricity, the largest public charging network in the UK, is sponsoring the International Charging Infrastructure panel. Daniel Bentham, Managing Director at Ubertricity UK and France, joins us now as our panel keynote. to begin this session. So if you have any questions for Daniel, or indeed our other international charging infrastructure panelists, please post them to us via the chat function now. Daniel, great to see you. Thank you for joining us. We're really greatly anticipating your presentation, so it's over to you.
Great, thanks Marie, and thank you to everyone for dialing into the first panel session of today of the International Charging Infrastructure Panel. As Marie mentioned, I'm Daniel Bentham, the Managing Director of Ubitricity UK, but I'm also responsible for opening up the markets in France as well. As Marie also mentioned, we're the largest public network in the UK at the moment, with over 2,600 publicly available charge points, and we've developed all of that in the last 18 to 24 months. So what we've been able to do is move very quickly into a relatively new market for Ubitricity, and I'd like to share with you some of our experiences in being able to do that. So next slide, please. So as Marie mentioned, really we're looking at the challenges that we face when entering a new market, but also some of those lessons that we can learn from our previous experience in other markets and how we can then set ourselves up for success. So next slide, please. And in doing that, I would like to shed a bit of light on the subject. So next slide. So when we look at the new markets, what we try not to do is look at too many of the differences initially. What we want to look at is what's common between those markets. And really what we're seeing at the moment is a huge focus on climate change, the global impact of climate change, and looking at how markets are readying themselves to address some of those challenges. And part of addressing that challenge is also focused on how do we move from fossil fuels to low carbon renewable forms of electricity generation. And so this is the energy transition that we're seeing happening everywhere. So how do we factor that into what the markets, and how we then set ourselves up for entering those markets? Another big piece is around the infrastructure, and this was mentioned by the Secretary of State at the start. It's really important that we look at infrastructure as not only addressing the concerns of consumers today and making sure they have access to infrastructure, but also making sure it's the right infrastructure to address climate change and also to integrate the energy transition and renewables in the future. So we split infrastructure into two parts: the existing infrastructure that we have today, and what most people don't always realize is that the infrastructure that we have today will still be there in 2030 and 2050. Even in the most developing markets, they are still going to be reliant upon existing infrastructure to deliver those low carbon solutions. So how do we then repurpose and utilize what we have today to its greatest extent? And then on the other side is the new infrastructure that we're looking to build out. And when that needs to be built out in a cost-effective way, which delivers the maximum impact, and how does that then complement the existing infrastructure? And the final element, which we can't forget about, and that's consumers. So consumers do differ in their buying habits between different markets and what they expect from service providers. But ultimately, consumers, no matter whether they're buying EV charging services or EVs or any kind of consumer goods, they're looking at the cost and the convenience of buying that service or that product, but also the quality. And so by taking those 5 elements and developing a core proposition, you're already setting yourselves up for success in going into those new markets. So next slide, please. But as well as understanding what's common across those markets, it's really important to understand the differences and how you can then orientate your core proposition to align with those individual market needs and those nuances. So a huge area for us and for many people within the EV charging sectors around regulation. And these are regulations which govern the electricity system, the built environment, the automotive sector, financial services, consumer protection. All of these areas come together with e-mobility. So we need to understand how we can operate within those regulatory environments, and that will determine ultimately what you can and cannot offer in some of those markets. Part of all of this is around the consumer as well. Again, consumers, even though they're governed by cost and convenience and quality, they all have their different buying habits and their different culture in terms of what they would like to buy within those markets. That needs to be factored in and orientated towards. We have stakeholders and partnerships, and so what we find at Ubitricity, because we work within the existing infrastructure, because we work within existing markets, there's a huge network already in place that we have to be able to navigate and to build those relationships. And what works in one market may not work automatically in another. So we need to understand how we can build out those new relationships. And then the same is also around competition. So competition is rife in the EV charging sphere at the moment. And just because you have a market dominance or market presence in one market doesn't mean that you'll automatically have that in another market. So having a really good understanding of the competition that's already active within the market in which you're looking to enter is key to being successful. So next slide, please. So what we look at this is around a skateboard approach or skateboard thinking. And this is common across lots of different sectors, and it's referenced a great deal in the automotive sector, particularly around EVs, where they're looking at building a skateboard platform. Then on top of that, you build your different models which address different markets. Well, we are doing exactly the same at Ubitricity. And so in terms of our skateboard thinking, next slide, please, we think there are at least 3 key factors which we're building into our skateboard platform. And one of those is around reusing existing infrastructure. It's absolutely key for Ubitricity that we are looking at the existing infrastructure that we have today. We realize it's going to be around for decades to come. So how do we make best use of that infrastructure and repurpose it so that it offers the new charging solutions that our customers are looking for? Then the next part is around looking at where consumers park today and how we can bring charge points to those parking spaces. So again, it's about not changing too much in one go, realizing that the convenience factor is very important to consumers. And what we don't want to do is then drive a different behavior type because ultimately that is very difficult to do. So if we can bring charge points to the parking spaces and provide them with that service, it means they're more likely to uptake EVs in the first place. And then the final part around the consumer behavior and the integration with the future smart low carbon energy system is around smart charging and encouraging consumers to park, plug in and play their part. And what we're doing there is that we are encouraging consumers that whenever they're parked to plug in, that it opens up the window for smart charging and integrating that into a renewable energy system. So typically our consumers only charge for 3 hours out of a 10-hour window. That's a huge amount of time there to really start to manage that charging event in a sympathetic way to a renewables grid. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of an illustration about how we've done that for the different markets in which we operate today. So in the UK, we've tailored our platform, our skateboard, to the power that's available through street furniture in the UK. So that's 5.5 kilowatts per charge point. That means that our drivers, our customers can charge their car in just over an hour. It will replenish their 28 miles of their typical daily commute. So a very convenient way for them to charge their cars on the street today. We've also offered a new payment method in the UK, and it's now been offered elsewhere, including France, but that's looking at a pay-as-you-go model. So there's no need to download an app, no need to have a membership or join a roaming network. Anybody can turn up to a public charge point today and charge their car in a convenient way. In France, we've got a couple of other tweaks on our skateboard for that market. So we've offered a twin socket charger in France. So we have a Type 2, but also a Type E. So the Type E is for those EVs which were bought many years ago and don't currently use a Type 2 socket, but it's also for those users who want to then charge their electric bikes or electric motorcycles as well. So it becomes more of a universal product for the all e-mobility. And we also offer roaming there through Girev. So in France, you can use Girev, but we haven't rolled that out to the other markets because those other markets haven't quite demanded that same functionality yet, that same tweak. And then the third market, the homeland for Ubitricity, as we originated in Germany over 10 years ago, really the tweaks for that market stem around the smart cable, which you saw in the opening video. And that was the original payment method for Ubitricity, not so prevalent in the UK, not so prevalent in France, but very common in Germany. And we've tailored the market there towards the fleets. So utilizing the smart cable and the billing functions there, we offer corporate and fleet services on top of the public services, which are also available in the UK and France. So what I'm trying to do there is give you an idea about how that skateboard platform can give you that core proposition, which means that you can offer something to lots of different markets with those tweaks, but in a cost-effective way, utilizing existing infrastructure. And what that has meant for Ubitricity in the UK, at the very least, is that in little over 18 months, we've installed over 2,600 charge points on the street for public use on behalf of local authorities. And that gives you an idea of the scale and the pace at which you can achieve if you can set yourselves up for success in those new markets. So next slide, please. So just to reframe the question there, so what challenges do your local markets face? with the rollout of charging infrastructure and what lessons do you take from those other markets. Well, hopefully I've given you a flavour there, some of the lessons that we've taken from our time in Germany, coming into the UK and then going out to France. Next slide, please. But how they take their first steps into entering those new markets. Next slide. And handing back to Marie there, I really am interested to hear some of the questions from the other panelists and from the audience too.
Daniel, thank you so much for opening up our first panel of day 2, and amazing, amazing insights into how you're thinking about the differences and commonality between those markets and how you approach that. It's really, really interesting. Over to a question that's come in, which is about asking, will you then look to bring the things that you've perhaps focused on, say fleet services, into, for example, the UK market?
Absolutely, it's certainly something that we're looking to build out with partners at the moment, and we're exploring this. I think the way we'll do it in the UK will have different tweaks to what we've done in Germany, for instance. So we will not necessarily be looking at the smart cable type hardware product, and we might be looking to digitize that offering for the UK as things have developed in the UK in a slightly different way. We've already set about publicly announcing some partnerships. So last week we announced a partnership with Bolt, which is a ride hailing app very similar to Uber, and in fact as large as Uber in some of the markets. And what we're looking at there is how do we then help fleets transition to electric mobility, and in particular their drivers. So when people think about fleets, they often think about fleets returning to a depot, returning to a site at night. But a huge proportion of fleets are actually return to home, and invariably those homes don't have off-street parking. So you find vans and taxis and minicabs parked up and down the streets of the UK. So what we're doing is building out the fleet offering so that they can do all of the accounting behind the scenes in terms of the corporate account, but also making sure that those fleets have access to the charge points on the street as well for their drivers. So that's the approach that we're taking in the UK. Still very new, but we're looking to announce a little more next year. Oh,
brilliant. And perhaps time for one quick question in addition, which is just to say, obviously, this year, a lot of movement to online working in response to the global pandemic. You talked about, really understanding a local market and your partnerships and your stakeholders there. So I guess a question about how important it is to have a presence locally to that market, and the pros and cons of greater online working, which in some ways fits very, very well with the e-mobility agenda and the transformation of transport, but also makes it perhaps harder to build those relationships.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think the advances in remote working and using conference facilities has been fantastic over the last 12 months. Considering doing this a year ago, I think most people thought it impossible to have events like this, but now it's very common in the mainstay. For us, though, being present in the market is absolutely key. You have to have not only a physical presence, but a really good understanding of the culture, the regulations, the customer in those markets. And the markets are changing so quickly. It's a very nascent industry. And if you're not present, you can very quickly lose touch. So certainly being in the UK with a team based in the UK and in North London, we've been able to then roll out in Liverpool and Oxford and Portsmouth and other cities probably far more quickly than we might have done if we were trying to do that too remotely from Germany. And that's a model which we're copying for France as well. We already have people based in Toulouse who are looking to then roll this out in France as well.
Marvellous. Well, Daniel, thank you once again for sharing your thoughts and getting us going on this first panel. Please hang around. We will bring you back into the panel discussion once our other panelists have spoken. And once again, to our online audience, if you've got questions, please send those to us in the chat now. So on to our second International Charging Infrastructure panel speaker. Joining us from the Netherlands is NewMotion CEO Melanie Lane. NewMotion provide access to 155,000 charge points over 35 countries, the largest charging network of Europe. Melanie, it's wonderful to have you here. Over to you to tell us more about NewMotion's plans for charging infrastructure.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. So for those of you who don't know, NewMotion has been in the charging world for the last 10 years. And then 3 years ago became part of the Shell Group. And I've had the privilege of being CEO since April this year. I'm afraid I don't have any slides like Daniel did, so you're just going to have to put up with me, I'm afraid, for the next couple of minutes. But I just wanted to maybe share some of the experience that NewMotion has had over the last 10 years, and particularly draw on 4 areas of learning that we've built as we've worked to address both sides of the adoption challenge. So stimulating demand on the one hand, and then investing and growing in infrastructure on the other. And I'll focus on those as kind of 4 themes that we see pretty consistently across markets, although I fully agree with Daniel's comments that a lot of your success then comes from taking those themes and tweaking them and applying them to the specifics of each market. I think the first one that I would want to highlight is around the economics of investment. And so this really is about demand generation, which is really important to the overall economics of investment across the ecosystem. So unit costs and overall returns only really become attractive when users and usage reaches a tipping point. And we've seen many different approaches across Europe to demand generation, from awareness building to legislation, incentives. And I think a key opportunity that we see here is to really help drive adequate awareness and education. I think as Grant talked about right at the beginning, this is a massive shift in mobility, once in a generation, probably once in 100 years. So we've never really seen a shift in mobility like this before. And so consumers and businesses rightfully and understandably need really clear information and assurance as they look to make that switch. We spend quite a lot of time speaking with individual drivers as well as businesses, and the challenges associated with that transition can often be really quite overwhelming. So education and awareness is one of the areas that we really see as important as an industry, where we can potentially do more. The second kind of theme, I guess, or learning or insight is around user